Now, we need to understand that without any doubt, because we have embraced Islam. It began back in 2001 when we didn't want to offend anybody when they began to go after terrorism. It has turned full circle now that the Islam nation has gained power and control in the United Nations where people fear to speak out against them. In fact, those who do have been ousted from the UN and not allowed to go back. They're passing laws right now in the UN. They have already passed resolutions last year that the United States and Israel has not adopted, and a few other countries, that says that if we raise our voice against or offend the Islam people, they have a right to bring you to court. They have a right to have you arrested as a hate crime. And we need to understand what's going on before our very eyes. Just this past year, our president says we will no longer have the day of prayer, Christianity, but participated in the day of prayer and fasting for Islam. Now, did we see that actually took place this year? I hope we realize what's going on here. We're at the beginning stages of the thorns, the briars, the tares, rising up where the Bible says because we have not embraced God and we did not drive out the foreign gods, He will no longer drive them out from before us. We are at the beginning stages. Then he goes on to say here, it says, and know for certainty, God tells us, without any doubt, because you have done this, know for certain that the Lord your God will no more drive these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps, they shall be scourges in your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land. The thorns in your eyes until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Now, before King David died, he left a warning before us. 2 Samuel 23 verse 6 says, but the sons of Belial, we went through that last week through the sons of Belial law. Basically what it says is worthless human beings. Good for nothing, useless, waste, remember Esau, waste, goat. All of them shall be as thorns thrust away because they cannot be taken by hands. In other words, once they're there, once the thorns are there, have you ever tried to clear a field? Some of you might be farmers. When you get the thorns out in your field, you can't hardly get those things out there. You grab them with your hands, you just can't get them out. They are going to destroy and tear your skin up. He says, but the man that shall touch them must be fenced with iron. In other words, if we're going to, once they're there, the only way you're going to be able to combat what is in our midst that came up from the middle of our nation, the nation all around the world, all the nations, when they come up, the only way you can get rid of them is with iron, and that's with Jesus Christ. Now, you've got to be fenced like God says, put on the whole armor of God. The whole armor of God. And we think we can go out and defeat Satan ourselves? We are kidding ourselves if you think you can do that. The parable of the sower now. Let's explain that. Let's go into that parable. So when he sowed some seed fell by the wayside, the fowls came and devoured them. We're going to talk about that next time. Some fell on stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprang up because they had no depthness of earth. Genesis 4, the curse of Cain. Now we're talking about something here, the stony places. Remember, we've got to connect the dots, putting all these terrible pieces together. Verse 10 of Genesis chapter 4 says, the voice of your brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. Now I want you to understand the voice of your brother's blood. It's written strange that the blood can talk. That's quite interesting, the blood, the way it's written. Now keep that in mind because we're going to go into that at the close of today. And now you are cursed from the earth, which had opened up her mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. And when you till the ground, it shall not henceforth yield her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond you shall be in the earth. So God's giving us here, at the beginning, the conception of this stony place, the wayside. Now what does the Bible say here with the wayside? The curse of Cain talks about a fugitive and a vagabond. Now, keep that in mind. A fugitive and a vagabond, Cain's going to be. The stony places, the Bible goes through with the stony places, says not henceforth yield unto you her strength. The Egyptian god Seth, the god of the desert, the land that doesn't grow, what God's telling Cain, the introduction of Satan's seed into mankind. In fact, you go into Genesis 4, we're going to cover one day in the future, the paradigm of Genesis chapter 4 is actually the paradigm of the Antichrist. Everything you find in the Antichrist, you will find happening in this chapter. That's just giving you something more to think about as we go through this. It will no longer henceforth yield her strength. Now, stony places, it means, what do you have when you have stone? You break them down, you crush them up. What do you have? You have sand. It turns into sand. In other words, it's filtering through. And where do the descendants of Cain live? Where do the descendants of Ishmael live? All right? You know that in your mind, and I'm going to show you in the Bible in just a little bit. Now, remember what I just said about the voice of your brother's blood. We're going to cover another Hebrew word before I close today. I like to just pick out one word that applies to what we're talking about and bring out greater depth of understanding before we close today. We're going to talk about the voice as we close. The parable of the sower continues. So when you sow, some seeds fell by the wayside, the fowls devoured them up. Matthew 13:19 says, when one hears the word of the kingdom and understands it not, then comes the wicked one and catches away that which was sown in his heart. Kind of giving you the impression like a bird. It's coming in at the wayside. It's coming in, and what it does when a bird is always flying over and hovering, it comes down and it catches up what it is. So this is, says, which is sown in his heart, this is which receives the seed by the wayside. Now, the question of who are the fowls, and so we're going to cover that next time. I already showed you a little picture of one of the pictures, but the Egyptians had lots of gods, and there's actually a couple of them. In fact, the Bible doesn't have very much to say nice about birds except doves. You find when you go through the whole Bible, you see there's not a lot of good things said about birds in the Bible. The parable of the sower continues. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. Verse 27. So the servants of the household came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in the field, and where thence was the tares? In other words, how did we get this in the field that you had all this good seed being sown? Notice the characteristics of the tare and the thorns are very much the same. They are coming up from within the ground. The big difference is that the thorns associated being wild from the countryside or wayside or wilderness, and both the tare and the thorn are in the midst of the good seed. In fact, they are intermingled. In fact, we're hearing people around the United States already saying, well, how in the world did we get into this mess? You hear that all the time. It's like, what in the world happened to us? It's because we didn't obey God. I mean, it's really simple. God says you don't have anything to do with these other gods. And we're saying, oh, but we're a Christian nation. We've got to accept everybody in their beliefs. We don't even have to have anybody speak English anymore. How many times have you talked to somebody and you can't understand a word they're telling you? But you got to deal with them because they're running everything. You go buy your gas, you go to a motel, you try to get into a cab. Yeah, we just tried to put in a kitchen countertop at my mother-in-law's house, and I like to lost it. I had to leave because I'm buying it from some Oriental lady who's putting it in through a Mexican, and somebody else is speaking Asian. And I'm not getting a word in. I said, well, I said, look, I got to get out of here. But that's who everybody, I mean, they're all running everything. It's the stranger, the sojourner from within. This is, I'm not making this up. You guys know this as much as I do. But I'm telling you what's coming. As soon as these tapes come out, there's going to be people out there in the future who are saying, hey, wait a minute, look what he's talking about here. Put him in jail. We need to understand. I'm laughing, but that's coming. All right, here goes. Until the fruit and the wheat appear, the wheat and the tares and the thorns, they all look the same. Now, you get some beautiful bushes out there. Have you ever gone out and said, that's a pretty bush. You go to take it out like a weed, all of a sudden your hands are full of thorns. That says you can't touch some thorns with your hands. You better be guarded with iron. The analogies are so clear. The Bible shows us that the thorns or Ishmael, the tares are Esau. So how did the wheat, the tares, and the thorns come to dwell together? All right, so the Bible is very clear now, is what they are in the parables. See, Jesus Christ was giving us more than just something for the heart. He was giving us a warning message at the end time to give us something to be aware of what's coming. How did these come to dwell together in common ground or in the midst? Genesis 16:1 says, Now Sarah's wife, Abraham's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. Now what's interesting is when you start studying this, like, where did they get an Egyptian handmaid? Right? Where did they get an Egyptian handmaid? Now, we always understood as a church what Egypt was. When God came down, He put Moses in charge. Moses, the type of Jesus Christ, coming out of Egypt, which was pictured as sin. Right? Come out of her, God tells us in the New Testament, come out of her, my people. Come out of sin. Now we find, all of a sudden, when we begin reading the story about Abraham, we've got, right in the midst of Abraham's tent, the concubine, he eventually becomes his concubine, the handmaid who's an Egyptian. Well, that's interesting. How do we start mingling all this together? Well, we go right back to the beginning, and there it is. Verse 2. And Sarah said to Abram, Behold now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing. I pray you go into my maid, that it may be that I can obtain children by her. And Abraham hearkened to the voice of Sarah. Well, Abram, not Abraham yet. Now that was interesting. He should have said, well, no, you're my wife. Let's trust God. Now you wonder, well, I wonder what she looked like. Maybe she's pretty young and exciting. And they said, well, that's a pretty nice deal for me. All right, so he didn't trust God to do it. He listened, and all of a sudden now, he's got a problem coming. So Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the maid, the Egyptian, and Abram dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Now, how many wives out here would do that today? Yeah, you thought that man crazy before that came about, wouldn't you? So he went unto Hagar and she conceived. And Sarai said to Abram, My wrong be upon you. I have given my maid into your bosom. And she saw that she had conceived. I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judged between me and you. Now, she knew it was wrong. It happened, and she said, okay, look, in other words, my sin now is on you. It's your fault that this all happened. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, my maid is in your hand. Do to her as it pleases you. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face, and the angel of the Lord found her in the fountain, in the water, in the wilderness, by the wayside, by the fountain, in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, from whence did you come, and where are you going? And hence we find the nation there are like nomads, always coming and going. They're never really settled. He says, I fled from the face of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit yourselves unto her on her hands. The angel said to the Lord, I will multiply your seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And that's what we have today. We have this multitude of these two nations. The same promise given to Abraham for multitude, the same promise given to Ishmael, verse 11. The Lord said unto her, Behold, you are with child, you shall bear a son, call his name Ishmael. Remember, we just read he's going to be the wild man. He's going to be against every man, every man standing against him. And what's interesting about the nation, the Arab people, is they're always fighting. Now, I said when President Bush went into Iraq for the war, it's a war that had to be fought, but a war that will never be won. Now, you can come back and the troops will say, yeah, we won, we've got a new government in place, but they will always be at war with one another. We need to understand that. That is the prophecy of Jesus, of God of the Old Testament, which is Jesus Christ. We need to understand that. We think we can change that. We can't. In fact, the parable says that they will stay together until the separation of the wheat and tares be put into the fire. That means until Christ returns. All right. Ishmael means God will hear. He will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man is against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. The characteristics of Ishmael, the wild man. And you ever notice when they even have the funerals, they're running around and he's screaming and hollering and shooting guns up? It's amazing. You don't think that way, but they do. They